Julie had always been cautious. Living in a bustling city meant she was no stranger to the occasional unsettling encounter, but she prided herself on staying safe. Tonight, she had stayed late at her friend's house, catching up over wine and laughter. When she realized how late it was, she decided to call an Uber rather than walk the dimly lit streets alone. The app showed her driver was only 2 minutes away. His name was Mark, and his profile picture showed a middle-aged man with a friendly smile. The car, a black sedan, pulled up in front of her friend's building right on time. She said her goodbyes, stepped into the car, and fastened her seatbelt. "Good evening, Mark," she said, trying to be polite even though she was exhausted. "Good evening, Julie," Mark replied, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "Long night?" "Yeah, catching up with an old friend," she responded, leaning back into the seat. The interior of the car was spotless, almost eerily so, with a faint smell of pine air freshener. Mark nodded and started driving. Julie watched the city lights blur past, her eyelids growing heavy. She glanced at her phone to check the route, making sure they were heading in the right direction. Everything seemed normal, so she allowed herself to relax. After a few minutes, Mark struck up a conversation. "So, what do you do for a living, Julie?" "I'm a graphic designer," she replied, stifling a yawn. "What about you? Do you drive full-time?" "Mostly," Mark said, his eyes fixed on the road. "But I have other interests. I'm actually a bit of a collector." Julie raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what do you collect?" "Just interesting things," he said, his smile widening in the rearview mirror. There was something in his tone that made Julie uneasy. She shifted in her seat, trying to shake off the feeling. She checked the app again and noticed they were still on course, but something felt off. The cityscape was becoming less familiar, the streets darker and more isolated. "Are we taking a different route?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Just a shortcut," Mark replied smoothly. "Don't worry, we'll get you home safe and sound." Julie didn't like this. She decided to text her friend just in case, but when she tried to send a message, she realized there was no signal. The city was notorious for its dead zones, but this seemed too convenient. She glanced at Mark, who was now humming softly to himself. The tune was unfamiliar, a discordant melody that only added to her growing sense of dread. "Can you please take me back to the main road?" she asked, her voice firmer now. "Relax, Julie," Mark said, his tone still friendly but with an edge that sent chills down her spine. "We'll be there soon." Julie reached for the door handle, considering whether to make a run for it at the next stoplight. But the doors were locked, and there were no stoplights in sight. The streets were empty, and the buildings around them looked abandoned. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked out the window, desperately searching for anything or anyone that could help. But the city had turned into a labyrinth of desolation, and Mark showed no signs of stopping. "Please, let me out," she said, her voice trembling. Mark's smile faded, and his eyes in the mirror grew cold. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Julie. We're almost there." Panic set in. Julie's hands shook as she tried to find a way to unlock the door or roll down the window, but nothing worked. The car seemed to be a prison on wheels, and Mark was the warden. Suddenly, the car took a sharp turn, and Julie was thrown against the door. When she looked up, she saw they were heading down a narrow dirt road surrounded by thick woods. There were no lights, no signs of civilization. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. Mark didn't answer. He just kept driving, his face a mask of eerie calm. The road grew rougher, and the car jostled violently with each bump. Julie felt a surge of adrenaline. She knew she had to do something, anything, to escape. She reached into her bag, searching for her pepper spray. Her fingers closed around the canister and she pulled it out, ready to defend herself. "Mark, stop the car now or I swear I'll use this," she warned, holding up the pepper spray. Mark glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Ignoring his warning, Julie aimed the spray and pressed the button, but nothing happened. She shook the canister frantically, realizing with horror that it was empty. Mark laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the car. I told you, Julie, I collect interesting things, and you're going to be my next piece. The car came to a sudden stop, and Mark turned to face her, his expression predatory. Now, be a good girl and don't make this harder than it has to be. Julie felt a surge of primal fear. She threw open her door and scrambled out of the car, running into the dark woods. Branches scratched at her skin, and the ground was uneven, but she didn't stop. She could hear Mark behind her, his footsteps growing louder. Desperation drove her forward. She stumbled over roots and rocks, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The woods seemed endless, a never-ending maze of shadows and fear. Then she saw it, a small cabin in a clearing. Hope flared within her as she sprinted toward it. She reached the door and pounded on it frantically. Help! Please help me! The door creaked open and an old woman peeked out, her eyes widening in shock. What on earth? Please let me in, Julie begged. He's after me. The woman hesitated for a moment, then pulled Julie inside and slammed the door shut. Who is after you, dear? Julie struggled to catch her breath. My Uber driver. He's crazy. He tried to kidnap me. The old woman locked the door and peered out the window. There's no one out there now. You should be safe here. Julie collapsed onto a chair, her body trembling. Thank you so much. The woman offered her a cup of tea. Drink this. It'll help calm your nerves. Julie took the cup with shaking hands and sipped the warm liquid. For a moment she felt a semblance of safety, but then she heard it, the sound of a car engine approaching. No, she whispered, her eyes widening in terror. The old woman glanced out the window again. Stay here. I'll see who it is. Julie wanted to stop her, but her body felt heavy, her limbs unresponsive. She realized too late that the tea had been drugged. Darkness closed in around her as she heard the door open and a familiar voice speak. Good evening, ma'am. I'm here to collect something very precious. Julie tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was Mark's face, smiling down at her, before everything went black. When Julie woke up, she was in a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one displaying bizarre, macabre items, dolls with missing eyes, animal skulls, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. She was strapped to a chair, her wrists and ankles bound tightly. Mark stood in front of her, holding a camera. Welcome to my collection, Julie. You're going to be my masterpiece. As the camera's flash went off, Julie's mind filled with terror and despair. She realized there was no escape. Mark's collection was complete.